How many of you read Capital all the way through, understood the inner workings of capitalism, Marxist economics, and then was like, on that basis, I need to join a party? Okay, maybe one. We got Chris. All right. No, I think like me, most of us likely joined because we experienced the absurdity and cruelty of this system in all its horrific manifestations. And maybe like me, you thought that understanding economics might be unnecessary. I mean, just look around. It's so clear how rotten this system is. The wealthiest 1% of Americans own a third of all the wealth, while the bottom 50% own only 4%. Almost 8 out of 10 Americans live paycheck to paycheck. The same percentage are in debt. And 1 in 4 workers is either completely unemployed or effectively unemployed, only able to find part-time work, gig stuff. 771,000 Americans are homeless, while 15 million homes sit vacant. Hunger affects 1 in 7 American households, while 40% of the food supply goes to waste every year in this country. All of this in the richest country in the history of the world, right? It's clear this is absurd. It's completely ridiculous. And we're told that this is the best of all possible worlds that we could possibly have. This is what we got. And we know in our gut that this isn't true. But if we don't have a scientific understanding of capitalism, of the system, we can't change that fact. If anger alone was enough, capitalism would have been overthrown the second it came into existence. Class society might have never even come about because clearly it just rests on such immiseration of the masses. Reformists think that they can do away with these different features that I've outlined, but keep the system itself in place. They have a kind of moralistic view of capitalism. They think that they can substitute bad, greedy, nasty bosses and politicians for nicer ones that will just do things differently, institute different policies and so forth. But we have to understand the inner workings, development, and contradictions of capitalism so that we can understand that we cannot tweak the system to address these symptoms. And this is why we're revolutionaries, not just because we want, super hardcore, we like violence, anything like that. It's because there's no other way. Reformists in power inherit the same crisis-ridden system that the right-wing and more reactionary forces are overseeing right now, and they're forced to manage capitalism in decline. But we understand that crises are not aberrations, but systemic to capitalism. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, liberals like Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history. Capitalism had triumphed over the planned economy of the Soviet Union, and once and for all had shown that liberal democracy, capitalist democracy, was the only path forward for humanity. But since then, we've seen 2008, 2020, endless wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, inequality growing sharper, global debt weighing down the economy. The crisis of capitalism has not been resolved despite what these liberals thought. And even many bourgeois now, if you read the capitalist press, are clutching their pearls, seeking ways to stave off the crisis and the revolutions that their system brings. So what is capitalism? Is it an idea? Is it an ideal? Is it a set of rules and regulations laid out by governments? Or is it just the expression of human nature, which is greedy and self-interested? I would say no, but Marx described it as one of the main modes of production in the development of human history. The way in which a given society produces and distributes the goods and services society needs, or as is more often the case, not producing and distributing what people and society actually need. And it has not always existed. We have to be really clear, right? It's only been around for a couple hundred years. Long before this, we talked yesterday during the women's liberation discussion about primitive communism, where there was no surplus for a ruling class to rise above society and live off the labor of others. We had slave society and feudal society that were organized in completely different ways. And each of these had a logic of their own, which is distinct and must be understood in their historical context and specificity. But this does not mean that they are not interconnected, that one didn't flow from the other and was determined by one another. This is a really important thing as we have a dialectical materialist understanding of the development of history. So what is the logic of the capitalist system? This is the question I want to try to answer today. Well, it's a highly complex and chaotic system with many moving parts and processes. But if we strip everything back, we see that individuals produce commodities for exchange in order to acquire other commodities that we need to live. So the commodity is the atom of the capitalist organism. It's not something you make that you then happen to exchange, but something you make solely for the sake of being exchanged for something else. If I make myself a sweater, that's not a commodity. But if I make one for sale, I've produced a commodity. And Marx describes capitalism as generalized commodity production and exchange. Everyone must exchange their commodities for other commodities that they need. Virtually everything we require in society, we have to get through an exchange on the market. There's no self-sufficiency, and maybe a few people can make it off the grid or whatever, but it's going to be with tools that were produced by society, things that they learned by society itself. So we've really created a really socialized production. So what is this commodity? The commodity has a dual nature, as Marx describes it. On the one hand, it has a use value. This is its natural qualities that make it useful to any given individual. And where that's determined, because the right-wing reactionaries will be like, oh, well, if someone just wanted a mud pie, does that, make it, useful and so forth? The determination of usefulness is only can it be sold on the market. So things that are unhealthy or bad for us or these kinds of things, if they can find a buyer on the market, they therefore have a use value. They're useful to someone. On the other hand, a commodity has an exchange value. And this has nothing to do with the natural, concrete qualities of the product that is the commodity, but in fact, it's a social relationship with other commodities. And essentially, it's how much of another commodity can I exchange for mine. It is a quantitative relationship, a ratio which commodities can be exchanged for one another. And this quantitative relationship between commodities themselves actually hides behind it a relationship between the producers who made this commodity and the amount of labor that they've put into their commodities. If we ignore the use value of these different commodities being exchanged, then the only common property that they have to be compared to, and it's clear, Marx wasn't starting from some theoretical basis of like, oh, this is how commodities are going to be exchanged for one another. He just saw commodities of completely different kinds with completely different use values were able to be exchanged for one another. So what was the basis of this exchange that someone could say, my commodity is worth the amount of your commodity that we're exchanging? And if you ignore the use value, then you see that the only common property that they have to be compared with one another against is that they are products of human labor. A certain amount of one commodity will be equal to another commodity because the amount of human labor is equal in each. So if we've ignored the natural qualities which make the use value of a commodity, we also have to ignore the different useful kinds of labor that goes into the commodity. We look at the labor time that a worker took to produce the commodity, and this forms its exchange value, its value. If two workers produce the same commodity, but one takes twice as long as the other, does that commodity that took twice as long have twice the exchange value? No. We look at the average socially necessary labor time to produce this commodity. And this is very, historically contingent. It depends sometimes by region, by country, but definitely by historical development of what we call the means of production, the technology, the machinery, and the technique. For instance, Marx talks about in Capital, when the power loom was introduced, replacing the hand loom, all of a sudden, the amount of labor time that was socially necessary to produce was cut in half, and therefore its value was cut in half. Its exchange value was now cut in half. But if you were still producing with a hand loom, you couldn't go onto the market and say, well, I took twice as long, so you got to give me, twice, I have twice as much value here. They say, no, I'm just going to buy the one that was produced by the power loom. So Lily and I have recently moved up from San Diego, and we've unfortunately had to spend a lot of time at IKEA. And and when you're walking around IKEA, I don't see on all the different furniture like 1 week, 3 years, 1 day, and all the labor times that it took these things. No, of course, we see prices, right? Price is exchange value expressed in money. And I like to think of the relationship between the price of a commodity and its exchange value as that between an anchor and a buoy. The exchange value is kind of like the anchor at any given time. But then if you have a buoy that's tethered to that anchor, with all the currents, the winds, and so forth, that buoy can fluctuate around where that anchor is. And this is the fluctuations of supply and demand that push price around its actual cost of production, and another way of saying socially necessary labor time. So what is this money that exchange value has to express itself in order to be realized? Well, money, like capitalism, did not always exist. Earlier modes of production were not predominantly based on exchanging goods internally. But as more surplus inside grows, it allows merchants to trade externally between different tribes and communities and societies and cities and so forth. And this then seeps into and erodes this kind of planned and communal style of producing in common and then rationing it out based on whether it was a bureaucracy, a priestly caste, or in earlier forms, much smaller tribal societies, some kind of council of elders or women or something like this. But as merchants are acquiring this surplus and trading between, that brings private ownership of production into these societies themselves. So money comes about as a universal yardstick to measure the value of all these commodities. It is the ideal expression of value for the concrete labor times of commodities, and it's a means of exchange. Everything can be exchanged for it, and it can be exchanged for everything else. It's something that, if you're, out traveling very far distances, you can't bring along just everything you own, like your cattle and maybe you have some sweaters and stuff like that. You need to be able to just exchange something that everyone also wants and can therefore then, when they bring it back, can be exchanged for everything else. So money, for that reason, begins as a commodity like all others. Gold and silver become the best commodities for money because of their ability to hold value. They don't depreciate very easily. They have high values in small quantities due to their rarity and so forth, and they can be easily transported. So they become the most widely accepted universal equivalent, this measure of value for the exchange of commodities. But eventually, as we know, money becomes mere banknotes and digital currency, which don't have a lot of value, if any at all, in themselves like gold and silver do, but are merely a token of value. It's a claim to a certain amount of the exchange value embodied in the wealth of society. And this change allowed the function of money as a means of credit to expand, extending the money supply beyond the current amount of value in commodities in society. So it allows production to expand beyond its limits of the market and speculate on future profits more easily, which has obviously become a staple in world capitalism today. But as it fluctuates away from the real amount of value in commodities in society, you get the menace of inflation, something we're all very familiar with. And this is essentially more money chasing fewer goods, this detachment of the money supply as an equivalent, as a representation of how much value is actually in society. And more money without more value in the form of commodities doesn't increase the actual value in society. Printing more money doesn't actually create more commodities that have actual value in society. And each dollar represents a smaller portion of the total value in society. So if the capitalists keep their prices the same, they receive less value in the form of the same amount of money as before, and therefore it eats away at the profits of the capitalists. So what do? They raise their prices, right? But then what do workers need to do, right? Now we're getting the same amount of money, and now we can't buy back as many of the commodities as we used to, and the purchasing power erodes. But if we're able to fight for higher wages, and if the capitalists concede to that, then the capitalists have to hike their prices up even further. And this is what the bourgeois economists call as the wage price spiral. They blame workers. They say, the workers needed higher wages, so I got to raise my price. But really, it's just the workers are having to catch up and to maintain their living standards. And so workers are not to blame. Now it can also happen. I've described it as an increase in the money supply. That's what causes inflation. It can also happen where the money supply remains the same, but there are shortages of commodities, so their price goes up. Say it's gas, right? A crucial commodity for all forms of production and consumption that other capitalists rely on. They have to pay more for that gas, and they therefore incorporate it into their cost of production and the price of their commodities. And this is how you can have a more generalized, expanding inflation that seeps into the whole economy. So let's return to the question of value here. The bourgeois economists that preceded Marx, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, that Marx, stood on the shoulders of, right, and saw himself as developing further, going to the logical conclusion of what they were trying to get at. Because unlike the bourgeois economists of today, these figures were genuinely trying to scientifically understand the capitalist economy, but they got hung up. They did put forward a labor theory of value, which is what I've been describing, is that labor is the source of value. But they couldn't explain what Marx called the enigma of profit. The bourgeois economists thought essentially it was just buying near and selling dear. That is to say, profit is found in the process of exchange, not in the process of production. But under capitalism, each capitalist is both a buyer and a seller of commodities. They buy the raw materials and they hire workers and so forth, and then they sell commodities. So if you're scamming on the one end, just like jacking up the price a little bit, well, then everyone else is going to do the same, and it would just kind of equalize. So Marx said this can't be the source of where profit comes from, and Marx discovered the roots of where profit came from, and that's why he's hated. Bourgeois economists today, they maybe nod to Smith and Ricardo, but they reject the labor theory of value because Marx showed what it actually explained about capitalism as a parasitic system, as we'll get into. So the crux of the thing is that Marx said commodities are on average sold at their cost of production, the socially necessary labor time to produce them, and yet the bourgeois make profits. How can this be? The bourgeois economists thought that when a capitalist hires a worker, that they're buying the worker's labor, but this is wrong. But for a sec, let's pretend that it is true. So I used to work for this guy doing landscaping, and I was provided the tools I needed. And then I spent 8 hours a day working, say for a month on a particular job site. So say that the PVC for the irrigation, the wear and tear of the shovels, the cutters, the jackhammer, the plant material, and the mulch cost my boss $5,000 for the month for me to use them. I then took those tools and raw materials, which simply transfer their existing value into the commodity that they produce. And I transformed all of this into a new garden, which the client will pay $15,000. If it is the case that my boss bought my labor, then clearly I should have been paid $10,000, right? Well, I can tell you that was definitely not the case. But if it were, then clearly my boss would just be breaking even. There'd be no profit. Not only would there be nothing for him to put in his pockets, but there would be no reinvestment. There'd be no expanding the business with new work crews, larger scale projects, and so forth. But as a matter of fact, right, my boss did make a profit, and I was not paid $10,000. And this is because in reality, he did not buy my labor, but my labor power. This is the human capacity to work, right? It's not the work itself. It's our ability to work for a given amount of time. And it's this special commodity because unlike in any other mode of production, it's the first time it's commodified under capitalism, and it puts out more than it needs to take in. The use value of the labor power is the labor itself, the labor that it can perform, right? But its exchange value, its cost of production, is less than the value it can produce as a use value. And this contradiction between the use value of labor and the exchange value of labor power is the basis of profit and the inequality between the capitalist and the worker. So if labor power is a commodity, my ability to work, then, like I said, it has an exchange value as a socially necessary labor time. This is the groceries, the rent. Maybe you need a smartphone today. Pretty much everyone needs one in order to work, communicate with your boss, and have them track you and all that kind of stuff. And maybe you need a car. Definitely, if you're in LA, you probably need to afford a car and you need to afford gas. But you also, it's not just the day-to-day things, but also the education and the training, the created the kind of labor that you're able to provide for the capitalist. And these are all generally reflected in the price of your labor power, which we call a wage. And again, we can return to this anchor in the buoy. The price of labor power is fluctuating above or below, oftentimes below the exchange value of labor power. And workers must fight to keep it up so they can afford to continue living. But we have to be clear, it's the average amount of wages to reproduce the working class so they can come back and work another day for the capitalists. So even if certain workers are falling off, as long as in general the working class is able to survive, this will kind of set that limit. But it's a question of the class struggle here too, right? It's not just some fixed law. Workers fight to keep it up and to push it up higher and higher, taking more of the value that they produce. So the working day is divided into two parts. There's the necessary labor time and the surplus labor time that goes into the working day. So the necessary labor time is that amount of time that you work producing value for your boss that then covers your wage. If you're highly productive, if your boss is good at exploiting you, as we're getting into, you'll work very quickly to make back that wage. And then the rest of the time you're working, right? If they say, oh, I'll give you, $20 an hour, and then you produce $20 an hour, you don't get to just go home and say, okay, well, I've made it back. No, they hired you for 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever it is. And so they're going to squeeze you for all of those 8 hours, even if you've already covered, your wages necessary. And the difference between the necessary and the surplus labor time is what we call the rate of exploitation. I think oftentimes people talk about exploitation as if it's just like, oh, your boss is really mean, like you're like really exploited and they're just really aggressive or something like this. But actually, it's just this ratio between the necessary time and the surplus time. And so the boss wants to make your labor power as cheap as possible in order to reduce the amount of time that you're working just to reproduce your wages, which they're going to pay you back in the next day or the next week or whatever. But during the surplus labor time, what the worker produces is not just value, but surplus value, right? This is the value above and beyond what it takes to pay yourself back. And this is the source of profit for the capitalists. And so in order to increase their profit, they maximize the surplus labor time and minimize the socially necessary labor time to produce the worker. And this is what allows capitalism to grow and expand historically. It urges them to get better machinery and take that surplus or a portion of it, plow it back into production, and therefore increase productivity and lower the cost of production for their commodities so they can outcompete their rivals. Marx didn't title his most famous work Commodities or Price or Value. He titled it Capital. So remember I said if I produce a sweater for myself, it's not a commodity. But if I produce it for sale, then it is. Well, if I took that money that I got for the sale of that sweater and I opened up a sweater factory, now the money I get from the sales and the initial money I got from that sale and the machines and the labor power that I buy to produce the sweaters are capital, and I am a capitalist. Don't clip that thing. If I took the money from the sale and went on vacation rather than in reinvesting in production, then that's no longer capital, right? And there's this thing Marx talks about that there can be capital in potential, right? Money sitting in a bank used for investments is likely, put aside for the sake of reinvesting in production. But until it's actually in production, hiring workers, paying for machines, and in that process, that labor process, the production process itself transforms it all into capital. Capital is value which is used to produce new surplus value by exploiting labor power, the labor power of the workers that it hires. It does consist of the tools, the land, factories, money needed to produce commodities, but only if the working class is hired to use them to produce new surplus value through the exploitation of their labor power. Marx described capital as the dead labor of the previous workers that had poured their labor into these machines, into extracting the raw materials, into creating the buildings and so forth. And it sucks the living labor of the workers' labor power that is hired to increase the value of the capital of the dead labor. And so he talks about it like vampire-like. Capital is sucking the living labor from the working class. And the end result of all of this is that there is more value than the capitalists started with, and this is the whole point for them. The whole point of capitalism is not to produce commodities. It's not to definitely do anything that society actually needs. The point is to produce surplus value, increase surplus value. But it doesn't stop here. If new surplus value is created in production, if the commodities containing this value go unsold, then that surplus value is not realized and you'll go out of business. So surplus value is created in production, but it has to be realized to the capitalist in exchange. And because there are other capitalists producing the same commodities, the capitalist has to produce as much as possible, as cheaply as possible. If my boss had picked some arbitrary price way exceeding the exchange value, the cost of production of producing that garden, then someone else surely would come by and along and say, hey, I'll do it for way cheaper because that's how much it actually cost me to do it. And clearly my boss would be kicked off the contract. Now, this changes a bit with monopolies and cornering markets and so forth. But looking at the essential logic, this is what drives the price closer to its actual cost of production. So competition between capitalists regulates that relationship between price and exchange value. Capital also therefore flows into the industry and into investments that give the highest rate of profit. But as other capitalists discover the same thing, they have to compete with one another and they drive down the cost. So maybe there's some new industry that a capitalist breaks into, a new machine that they use that allows them to produce way more and way more cheaply, but they still can make so much because the average price is about the same. They're going to make super profits. But then, people, especially nowadays, people catch on and they say, well, I want to get into that business. And all this capital, the banks get used for this, pours in and funnels into this industry, and they're forced to then lower their price in order to compete with these new capitalists that are in the game. And this drives the price closer to its cost of production. But it's not just workers struggling with their bosses for a greater share of the surplus value they create, but also capitalists competing with each other for the total profit in society. And it's not just between capitalists in the same industry as I've just described, but also between the industrialist, the landlord, the bankers. Each wants to take the biggest cut of the new value that's been created for themselves. I've heard sometimes you maybe hear a certain capitalist might be sympathetic to the workers saying, we need lower rent. But he's not sympathetic to the living standards of the workers. He would just love it if it was cheaper for his workers to live near the factory, and therefore he can pay them less because it doesn't cost as much for them to live there. I like this quote from Capital. Marx writes that competition subordinates every individual capitalist to the immanent laws of capitalist production as external and coercive laws. It compels him to keep extending his capital so as to preserve it, and he can only extend it by means of progressive accumulation. Or as the former Citibank chief executive Chuck Prince put it in 2007, that as long as the music is playing, you got to get up and dance. If the capitalists stop exploiting, they cease to be a capitalist, and someone else takes their place. Marx describes the capitalist as this personification of capital, this just meat suit driven by external laws, pushing them to have to continue to reinvest and lower their cost of production despite what they personally want. And this produces an anarchy on the market as each individual owner, each individual capitalist fights for their own individual company's position on the market and the share of the consumer's money that they're paying for these commodities, not what society actually needs. And so following this drive to accumulate more and more capital for accumulation's sake to outcompete rivals, we get the fundamental cause of capitalist crisis, the crisis of overproduction. This is the, I think, clearest expression of the contradiction between the productive capacity of society, the means of production, in contradiction with the property relations, the private ownership of these things prevailing, whereby the expansion of use values that society needs is stopped, it's halted because individuals own them and they only produce them if they can be sold for a profit. I like to think of the image of like a grown man wearing children's clothes he was given as a child, right? The growth of the content is far outstripping the form of the property relations. And because it's the unpaid labor of the working class which produces this abundance of goods and services in the first place, the exploitation of the labor power, the lowering of the necessary labor time, the increasing of the surplus labor time, the working class is never, as a whole, will never be able to buy back all of the commodities that they produce because they're not paid the full value of what they produce. So competition forces capitalists to continue producing as cheaply as possible, but eventually they produce so cheaply, and competition has driven the price down to such an extent to the cost of production, sometimes even below the cost of production, and there's so much on the market, so many commodities, they can't sell enough of their goods and services, and thus stop production. And this is when the crisis strikes. When the crisis hits, they lay off a bunch of their workforce, cut down supply to try and keep their profit margins up and better match the low demand that their own system has created. But it only deepens the crisis because now there's even less workers receiving wages to buy back the goods. And with each crisis, big companies eat up the small that can't weather the storm. The law of competition turns into its opposite and gives rise to monopolies. The very force that was supposed to be something that allowed anyone to get into the market and compete has now turned into something that stops competition. Not completely, of course, but it puts brakes on it, puts limits on it. Capital is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, and it's also centralized. So I think Joe was talking about last night vertically integrated supply chains, and this means that instead of having to buy from each capitalist on the supply chain, if you just own the whole thing or have like exclusive rights to deals with them, then you'll get to absorb much more of the profit that comes from production. And when the crisis hits, as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So just 500 US companies make up 2/3 of US GDP, and they employ 20% of American workers. And many more businesses and their workers are directly tied to the functioning of these 500 firms. As the crisis of overproduction strikes, the ruling class is forced to step in and use credit to get the system going again by allowing workers and companies to consume more of the overproduced goods they couldn't afford before. The money supply is increased beyond the actual value in society in order to try and galvanize the economy again. But this only, this influx of credit, this only sets the stage for larger and deeper crises in the future. They're really just kicking the can down the road because with credit comes debt. This dialectical unity of these two things. National, household, and corporate debt rises. As it stands today, most advanced capitalist states have debt to GDP ratios of over 100%. In the US, credit card delinquencies, not being able to pay back your credit card debt, are reaching the same levels they did in 2007 before the housing crisis. Delinquencies on subprime auto loan payments are at record highs today, and corporate debt levels are also staggering. We talked about the zombie companies, right? And the thing with debt is that it must be repaid, or else the lenders stop lending and stop propping up the system. So more and more of the capitalist profits have to go to paying interest on this debt. and less goes to reinvesting in production, creating more jobs, and lowering the cost of goods and services. And in order to counteract this depression on their profits, the capitalists and their state attack workers' pay. They attack their benefits, healthcare subsidies, and so forth. This is what we're seeing with Trump's big, beautiful bill. And clearly, they had, as Elon Musk put it, but they haven't gone far enough, right? They still have this mountain of debt. 2008 was the greatest crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression. It was an organic crisis of capitalism, not just a result of the regular boom and bust cycle of capitalism, but a result of capitalism having nowhere productive to go but to gamble and speculate. There was mass overproduction in homes, which was sustained by banks offering these 0% down, 0% interest until 2 years when the interest rates spike, giving them to people that they knew were not in a position to be able to pay these mortgage payments. And after a certain period, when the real interest rates kicked in, but the banks created these financial instruments, the CDOs and all these kinds of things that I'm not going to get too into right now, but it allowed them to hide the bad debt in with the good, and they themselves didn't really know what they were holding as far as this debt not being able to be repaid. But as long as they kept the debt machine going, with more credit being extended and people using it to buy homes, increasing the price of the homes with each foreclosure, with more credit being extended, the banks were able to get filthy rich for a time. But eventually, enough people were defaulting on their mortgages, and the banks realized the pile of valueless debt that they were holding that no one could pay back, and everything collapsed. They stopped lending to one another and so forth. So when the crash happened, the banks were bailed out with piles of cash from the government. Banks were effectively given money through quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. But the workers who had lost their savings in the banks and their pensions and so forth, defaulted on their mortgages, were totally left out to dry. The bankers took these handouts, and rather than investing in new production and creating jobs again, they gave themselves big bonuses and gambled on the stock market. The cost of borrowing money, the interest rates set by the Federal Reserve, were kept incredibly low to try and get the productive economy moving again. But this only fed more into the speculative casinos of Wall Street rather than a new boom time economy. Average GDP growth was 1% between 2008 and 2020. For comparison, China's growth rate in this period was 8%. On average. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the ruling class was forced to shutter all but the most essential services in production, and firing or furloughing workers, keeping them part-time, paying them less. And in order to keep the system alive so that companies could still sell their goods on the market, the ruling class had to dole out stimulus checks, right? Unemployment to workers and companies alike. So this was, again, right, we go back to inflation. New money without new value in production, not just no new value, but like a drying up of the value, and we saw lots of shortages and so forth. And as we emerged from the pandemic, we therefore saw a huge surge in generalized inflation where all industries were raising their prices. This was then compounded by gas and oil shortages due to the Ukraine war and cutting off Europe from Russian gas. This increased it, fueled it even more. And in order to combat this inflation, the Federal Reserve was forced to raise the interest rates on new loans to make borrowing money more expensive. So all these firms that were dependent, from 2008 onwards on these really cheap credit, these low interest rates, they had taken on massive amounts of debt that wasn't that expensive to pay off because the interest payments were relatively low. They now had to spend much more to service these debts. And both 2008 and the aftermath of the pandemic have created the conditions of today. They are crises that have exposed that capitalism has nowhere productive to go. So before 2008, going back to the 1970s and again in the 1990s and up until today, capitalist production has flowed out of the US to move closer to raw materials, supply chains, and of course, cheaper labor. The reinvestment of profits in production, which was the basis of capitalism's progressive period, has declined year after year especially since the 1970s. Forbes noted that reinvestment in the means of production for non-financial firms made up just 10% of US GDP at the end of 2023. They explained that big business is, quote, not leading an investment boom across the economy, even as the country faces massive challenges in the areas of climate change, artificial intelligence, and population aging. Now Trump thinks he's going to bring back a golden age of American manufacturing and a renaissance, all this, but he's going to have to compete with a much cheaper and more abundant labor and resources in China. They're already having to drive down their own cost of productions and automate away and so forth. So this is the reality, right? This post-2008 reality of 1% growth, of really fickle job markets and these kinds of things that we've been discussing this whole weekend. This is the reality we've grown up in. The bourgeois see an increasingly angry working class who has seen millions and millions of decent paying union manufacturing jobs go abroad so that the capitalists can realize a greater rate of profit by moving production to cheaper conditions. NAFTA is often talked about as kind of this like defining moment where this really accelerated. But this was not some random decision. They were following the iron logic of the capitalist system, which demands growing profits, and they had to find a way to achieve that. And in pursuit of these profits, the capitalists increase their exploitation of the working class, drive down their standards of living, all the while automating away their jobs to try to sell more commodities for cheaper. Like I said, this was the basis of the development of technology and labor-saving techniques in production. Historically, it was much cheaper to get a machine and hire fewer workers, but this process has in many cases reached its limits. In many industries, the cost of production of the worker has been driven so low that it's cheaper to hire workers than buy an expensive cutting-edge machine. Automation under capitalism is not about reducing the time humanity must spend working, but about cheapening the cost of production and increasing the productivity of labor to outcompete rival capitalists. Only socialism and a planned economy can take that technology and put it to its actual use of saving humanity from the drudgery and work that we all deplore, and allowing like our labor, our creative capacities to be used to things that we actually want to do. We have all of these unemployed and underemployed workers under capitalism who capitalism cannot make use of productively, profitably on the one hand, and then we have a bunch of overworked workers on the other hand who are having to work 50, 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks, not because there's no infrastructure to repair, no machines to implement, which could save us from having to work so much, but again, because they cannot make a profit. So we know that all things have a beginning, a period of development, and eventually a decline and decay, right? We're dialecticians. Change is at the root of all. Everything is a complex web of contradictions which drive it to develop at first, but then lead it into stagnation by those same laws themselves. Without this method of dialectical materialism, the bourgeois economists, the reformists alike, they think crises are merely the result of accidents, of fumbling of policy choice, of narrow national interests, which really get in the way of capitalism working the way it's supposed to. But it is precisely these crises which allow it to operate at all, destroying the overproduction and allowing a new upswing. But eventually, right, this runs out of room to grow and starts turning in circles. The snake begins to eat its own tail, and a new upswing is totally out of the question. We understand the development of capitalism also as a part of the development of history. It's not this isolated thing. We can see that the embryo of a new society has developed in the womb of this old decrepit system. Socialism and communism are not built by clearing the decks and starting anew. Socialism takes the massively developed productive forces of society, the forces that have created the potential for a world of superabundance for all, and takes them from the dying hands of the capitalists and puts it into the hands of the working class, not for profit, but for the needs of humanity. We can plan the economy and do away with overproduction, waste, and anarchy. We can produce in common and consume in common based on needs and abilities rather than exchange and exploitation. We will no longer, under communism, be producing commodities for the sake of sale, but use values in common for common consumption. Money will no longer be necessary as a means of exchange, which will no longer be the basis of production and in consumption. People will no longer be competing for jobs and profits, but will work together for a common stockpile of goods and services for those who produce the society. But only socialist revolution and the institution of a democratic workers' government can accomplish this. Capitalism itself has created a working class who work together to produce society. They come together every day at work and experience the same exploitation by the same class of capitalists. But there must be a party that can explain this exploitation of the workers, which is the only way that we're going to overthrow capitalism and bring about socialism. Thank you, comrades.
Communists of America is a podcast produced by our party, the Revolutionary Communists of America. If you agree with what was said in this podcast and you want to get organized, go to communistusa.org/join.